America, the land of freedom and opportunity. But less than a century after gaining independence, the nation would be torn apart by a brutal conflict. The American Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, was a defining moment in U.S. history. But why did this war, which claimed over 600,000 lives, really happen? Today, on History Unlocked, we explore the complex causes behind the American Civil War. The American Civil War is often attributed to a single cause, slavery. But the reality is more complicated. Let's first understand the larger context of the United States in the early 1800s. In the early 19th century, the United States was a young nation, but it was already beginning to pull in two directions. The North, with its growing industrial economy, relied on wage labor and was rapidly urbanizing. Cities like New York and Philadelphia were centers of commerce and manufacturing. Meanwhile, the South's economy was primarily agricultural, heavily dependent on cotton, tobacco, and, most importantly, slave labor. The South's plantation system was built on the backs of enslaved African Americans, while the North was beginning to embrace ideas of abolition and individual rights. These differences would soon lead to a deadly war. One of the first major attempts to address the divide between free and slave states came with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This legislation was a response to Missouri's application for statehood as a slave state. At the time, the Union had an equal number of free and slave states, and Missouri's admission threatened to tip the balance. The Missouri Compromise allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, but also admitted Maine as a free state to maintain balance. It drew a line across the Louisiana Purchase, stating that slavery would be prohibited in new states north of the 36°30' parallel. This appeased both sides temporarily. 30 years after the Missouri Compromise, another agreement was needed to resolve tensions over new territories acquired in the Mexican-American War. The Compromise of 1850 aimed to balance the interests of both the North and South. As part of the deal, California entered the Union as a free state, shifting the balance of power in favor of free states. In exchange, the South received a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens in northern states to assist in capturing and returning escaped slaves to their owners. The Fugitive Slave Act angered many in the North, especially abolitionists, because it forced them to participate in the enforcement of slavery. As a result, peoples from the North became more resistant to slavery, and efforts to help escaped slaves increased. The Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, became more active during this period, with figures like Harriet Tubman risking their lives to guide enslaved people to freedom in the North. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Sponsored by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, this act allowed settlers in these territories to decide for themselves whether they would be free or slave states, based on a principle known as popular sovereignty. The act repealed the Missouri Compromise line, and as a result, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters flooded Kansas, hoping to sway the vote. Violence erupted, and what became known as Bleeding Kansas symbolized the growing sectional conflict. Armed clashes between the two sides showed that compromise was no longer working. In 1857, the Supreme Court escalated tensions with its ruling in the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in free territories, which should have made him free under existing laws. The court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, ruled against Scott. The decision stated that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens under the U.S. Constitution and therefore could not bring lawsuits in federal court. Additionally, the court went further by ruling that Congress lacked the authority to ban slavery in federal territories. This decision nullified the Missouri Compromise, which had limited slavery's expansion, and opened all U.S. territories to the possibility of slavery. The ruling outraged Northern abolitionists and heightened fears that the federal government was controlled by pro-slavery interests. This increased sectional conflict and moved the nation closer to civil war. In October 1859, John Brown, a radical abolitionist, led 21 men, including 5 African Americans, in a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown's goal was to seize the arsenal's weapons and distribute them to enslaved people, sparking a widespread rebellion across the South. The group successfully captured the armory and several nearby buildings, taking hostages in the process. However, the surrounding area did not rise up in rebellion, and within hours, local militia and citizens had surrounded the armory, cutting off escape routes. By the next day, U.S. Marines, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, arrived to retake the armory. After a short but intense skirmish, in which several of Brown's men were killed, the Marines stormed the building. Brown was captured. He was quickly tried in a Virginia court for treason against the state, inciting a slave insurrection, and murder. On November 2, 1859, he was sentenced to death. But was later hanged on December 2, 1859, in Charlestown, Virginia. To the south, it was seen as proof that Northern abolitionists would use violence to end slavery. Brown's actions increased sectional tensions in the nation, making him a hero to many Northerners who admired his commitment to ending slavery, while Southerners viewed him as a symbol of Northern aggression. His raid and subsequent execution pushed the nation further toward civil war. The 1860 election marked a point in the escalating national conflict over slavery. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, campaigned on preventing slavery's expansion into new territories. His platform did not call for the immediate abolition of slavery in the South, but was seen by Southern leaders as a direct threat to their way of life and economic interests. Lincoln won the presidency with strong support from Northern states but failed to win any electoral votes in the South. This result confirmed Southern fears that their political power in the federal government was gone and that anti-slavery forces now controlled the presidency. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. The state's leaders claimed that Lincoln's election was the beginning of the end for slavery, and secession was necessary to preserve their rights and economic system. Over the following months, 10 other Southern states joined South Carolina: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. These states viewed secession as their only option to protect slavery and maintain their political autonomy. By February 4, 1861, the seceded states convened in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the Confederate States of America. They drafted a constitution explicitly protecting slavery as a permanent institution. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, was elected President of the Confederacy. With the formation of the Confederate government, any possibility of compromise between North and South vanished, making conflict inevitable. The stage was set for the Civil War. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces, under General P.G.T. Beauregard, began their assault on Fort Sumter, a federal fortification in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort, held by Union Major Robert Anderson, had been cut off from supplies for months, but Lincoln's decision to resupply it prompted the Confederates to act. For 34 hours, Confederate cannons pounded the fort, firing over 3,000 shells. With limited resources and no reinforcements, Anderson surrendered the fort on April 13, 1861, without any loss of life. This marked the official start of the American Civil War, a conflict that would last 4 years and claim over 600,000 lives. The Civil War was not just a sudden outbreak of violence, but the culmination of tensions. Central to these tensions was the issue of slavery, particularly its expansion into new territories. Northern and Southern states had developed different economic and social systems. The North industrialized and favored free labor, while the South's economy was deeply rooted in agriculture and dependent on enslaved labor. Beyond slavery, disputes over states' rights played a major role. Southern leaders argued for the right of states to determine their own laws, particularly regarding slavery, while Northern leaders emphasized the authority of the federal government to maintain national unity. Economic disparities also fueled the divide. The North's industrial economy contrasted sharply with the agrarian South, creating different interests regarding tariffs, trade policies, and internal improvements. By 1861, the two regions had become politically, socially, and economically divided, leading to the collapse of compromise efforts, such as the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. While slavery was the core issue, the war reflected the clash of two visions for America: a unified, centralized nation where federal law applied universally, versus a confederation of sovereign states with autonomy over their own affairs. The conflict ultimately reshaped the nation, leading to the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment in 1865. However, the end of the war marked the beginning of a long and difficult period of Reconstruction, during which the nation struggled to rebuild and redefine the meaning of freedom and citizenship. The legacy of the Civil War would echo for generations. Thank you for watching History Unlocked. If you've made it this far, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on more fascinating historical stories. What do you think was the most important cause of the Civil War? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would like to hear from you. See you in the next video.